Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for what promises to be a very interesting discussion on what we see as a growing and a very important trend, which is the launch of solo female arbitrator practices. We think this is a very relevant and important conversation to be having now for those young and more seasoned practitioners who are considering their career options or considering the next chapter in their career. And more importantly, it's also very relevant to understanding how we can all contribute to seeing greater gender diversity in arbitral appointments. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Maguelonne De Brugiere. I'm a senior associate in Herbert Smith Freehills Global Arbitration Practice. I will be co-moderating this panel with Michele Potesta, who's a partner at Levy Kaufmann-Kohler. Michele himself has participated in over 35 commercial and investment treaty arbitrations over the past 10 years as arbitrator, counsel, or tribunal secretary. And he's very experienced in state-to-state disputes, frequently advising the Swiss government on ISDS reform. Both Michele and I sit on the Equal Representation in Arbitration Young Practitioners Subcommittee, who are co-hosting this discussion today with Herbert Smith Freehills. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce and thank our brilliant panelists who've so generously agreed to take the next hour to share their experience in setting up their own shop and also their advice to those who are considering a similar move. So in no particular order, we have Lucy Greenwood. Lucy is an independent arbitrator specializing in commercial and investment arbitration, particularly in the energy sector. She has practiced international arbitration since 1998 and has acted as arbitrator in over 65 arbitrations since becoming a full-time arbitrator in 2017. Many of you will know Lucy for her work on the ERA Pledge, but also as the founder of the Green Pledge and the Campaign for Greener Arbitrations. Next up, we've got Brenda Horrigan. Brenda is an internationally recognized arbitration practitioner with over 30 years of experience globally, having worked in US, Paris, Moscow, Shanghai, Sydney, and now in Singapore. Brenda set up her own practice in 2022, and prior to that, she headed up the international arbitration practice in Australia for Herbert Smith Freehills. An interesting point about Brenda, she actually started her career as a transactional lawyer. Then we have Judith Levine. Judith has a background both in the public sector and in the private practice. She worked as an associate to a judge of Australia's highest court before moving to The Hague to undertake a judicial fellowship at the ICJ, following which she spent 5 years in White & Case's New York practice. After that, she returned to The Hague to work as legal counsel at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And after a decade at the PCA, Judith decided to move back to Sydney and set up her own arbitrator practice at the very start of the pandemic in February 2021. And last but certainly not least, we have Catherine Schroeder. Catherine is an independent arbitrator and practitioner based in Paris. She currently works at Schroeder Arbitration, which she also founded in 2021. And prior to that, she was an associate at Derain & Associés and then at Derain Garavi, where she was counsel. Catherine decided to go solo mainly to focus on her growing practice as an arbitrator. Now, all of our panelists have won a number of accolades and awards for being outstanding arbitrators and thought leaders. So we really thank them for their time today and look forward to everything that they have to share with us. Before I hand over to Michele to kick us off with the first questions, I just wanted to flag the usual housekeeping points. The first one is this session is being recorded so that we can make it available on the Pledge website and the YouTube channel, which we've just launched. We have muted all of you to avoid the usual issues. And then finally, but most importantly, we've had a fantastic uptake for this discussion with a huge amount of engagement already, with a lot of questions being submitted prior to the panel. We will look to get through as many of them as we can, and we will be leaving some time at the end for a Q&A session. That might be slightly optimistic, but that is what we are aiming for. Please use the Q&A function to send through any questions you have as we go. We'll try to tend to them as we go, but if not, we'll pick them up at the end or offline. And our panelists have already all indicated that they're very happy for you to contact them directly with any questions that you have also after the panel. Now, without further ado, Michele, if you want to get us started with FIFA starting.
Thanks, Mag. I'd like to start this discussion by asking our four speakers what were their personal motivations for setting their own independent practice. Why did you decide to go solo? Maybe Brenda, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, one motivation was simply leaving big law for conflict reasons and setting up an independent practice. And I came out, I started a practice in 2021, in the middle of the pandemic, when nobody could go into chambers anyway. And so setting up on my own just seemed to make sense, because if you're going to work from home, you might as well do it entirely on your own. So that was me.
Thanks. Catherine, what about you?
Well, actually, I think I have known almost from the outset of my career that I wanted to focus on becoming an arbitrator, and this may be explained by a combination of I think my desire to contribute to rendering justice, and I must admit a certain taste for deciding, and in fact I had a chance to be immersed in the arbitral tribunal world as soon as I started my career, having started alongside with Yves de Reims and having acted as secretary. So this, beside the fantastic training, confirmed my desire to become an arbitrator sooner than later. And in addition to that, I think I really wanted to explore what the world of entrepreneur would be. And with the evolution of the market and the desire of practitioners to diversify the pool of arbitrator, I thought that I should give it a try.
Thanks. That's so interesting. Judith, do you have the same? Did you have the same motivations?
Yeah, my motivations were both professional and personal. But professionally, I felt ready for the role. I love decision making and decision writing. I'd sat as arbitrator a few times and wanted to step up and do more of that than I could do within the confines of the PCA where I was working. And while I absolutely loved the decade that I spent there with great cases and an awesome team and working in a beautiful palace, I was starting to feel like I'd learnt what I could and was ready to be the arbitrator rather than assist the arbitrators. And on a personal level, I wanted to move home to Sydney after 17 years abroad, to give my kids an Australian childhood and see my parents and integrate in society in a way which you can't do as an expat. And I thought being an arbitrator I could do from anywhere, including Sydney, and yet still have the option of moving abroad again to continue it later down the track. There were a handful of prominent arbitrators in Australia, but I figured there was definitely room in the market for at least one more, especially from the next generation, and one with international experience.
Thanks, Judith. And we finished this first round with you, Lucy.
And I think for me, it was quite simple. I hit on a role that really plays to my skill set. And I'd only sat a couple of times. I'd been asked, I'd had to turn them away for conflicts. I'd been, because I was in a big law firm, and it was really, this is the job for me. This is the job that I want to make a career of. This plays to all my strengths. I really enjoyed being counsel in major cases for 20 years, but as soon as I sat as an arbitrator, I was like, okay, this is really absolutely my sweet spot here, in terms of I love to write. I love the decision making, very much like Judith and Catherine mentioned. I really love the case management and the people skills that you need, and I think they are often underestimated in life generally, but particularly in big law firms. And the way that you can manage a hearing effectively from this side of the table is a great skill, and I find that that's something that I really enjoy. So I did take, it was a bit of a leap, but it was a leap made with great motivation to make a success of it, because I fundamentally believe that it is the right job for me. I always say I was a very good waitress all the way throughout law school, and then I was a reasonably good counsel, and I'm hoping that I'm going to be a very good arbitrator, and so that'll be quite nice bookends to my career.
Thanks. All of you have mentioned your previous experience either in big law firms or boutique law firms or international arbitral institutions. Now that you've also experienced the different side of your career, what do you see as the advantages of going solos, and are there any drawbacks in taking this leap, as Lucy was saying? Judith, you would like to share what has been your experience so far?
Sure. So 3 benefits, one being the role, as I said, and Lucy too. I just love it. I love the decision making and even the case management side too. Second, the variety. All of us who work in this field get a taste for that. My cases range from football to fashion and cosmetics to construction under Korean law or Israeli law. And I get to work with a variety of colleagues all over the world. And a big plus, I think, for all of us would be the autonomy and the flexibility. I generally have control over my calendar in a way I never had as counsel, and a sense of freedom to pursue other projects and priorities. In terms of the drawbacks, one would be resources. I miss administrative support. I had awesome secretary at White & Case and at the PCA as well, but I've gotten used to doing my own FedEx labels and travel bookings and invoices, and I do have a great external accountant. Second, I miss the team. But I've found ways to replicate that. For example, my fellow executive directors of AKICA, chats with other arbitrators, and I've been finding ways to mentor young lawyers, which is an aspect I miss from the bigger institutions. But I'd say one of the biggest challenges is about the steadiness or lack thereof of the income. My income now is higher than it was ever, but it comes in sporadically. For many institutions, you don't get paid until the end of the case. So in some ways, I miss the comfort of a monthly salary. Also, there's the benefit that every dollar earned goes into your own pocket, but at the same time, the flip side is every dollar spent comes out of your own pocket. So you have to be a bit strategic about things that you might have taken for granted, like subscriptions or stationery or memberships. And 2 related challenges to that are knowing when to be confident enough in the workflow to say no to cases, and also knowing when to spend your time and money on business development. Do you pay for the fancy who's who listing, fly to Singapore to speak at a conference? That's a constant balancing exercise, competing with actual casework. I tend to prioritize casework because I think there's no better business development than doing a great job, but you can't ignore the other activities either.
Lucy, did you encounter the same type of challenges as Judith, and of course the same type of benefits?
I did, and Judith has summed it up brilliantly in the way she's laid out the benefits. And I often say that it's ironic that in the wider scheme of things there are relatively few female arbitrators, because it's actually the most family-friendly job I've ever had, and that's for the reasons Judith articulates, that you are 100% in control of your calendar and your time. That said, I spend all my working time is dedicated to Greenwood arbitration, and whether that may not be arbitrating in the traditional sense the whole time, but it's certainly in promoting myself as an arbitrator. The difficulty Judith identifies with where the bang for your buck is, which is really important and very, very difficult to analyze. It comes down to the difficulty that we all face, which is it's very opaque as to where your appointments really come from. And so certainly early on, when I first got established, it was very much a sort of scattergun approach. I've got better at targeting my marketing. I've got better at learning where's value for money, and when I say value for money, that's also value for my time spent. But it isn't easy. I wish every appointment just came with a sort of flow diagram as to who I spoke to where and how I ended up getting that matter. But for me, and I think I speak for everyone on the panel, the benefits certainly far outweigh the disadvantages.
That's so interesting. We've heard already so much interesting food for thought, and some of you, we will come back to the financial planning in a minute, which of course is one of the most interesting and important aspects that we want to discuss. But Judith also mentioned some of the practical aspects linked to this new occupation, perhaps the lack of a secretary and these kind of things. So I wanted to ask, and this is a question that several of our attendees asked in advance when we asked them to submit questions, is from a practical point of view, when you decide to take the leap, what are the practical steps that you have to envisage, consider, and take in order to be successful? Catherine, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. I think, of course, it's not a decision that you take out of the blue, and it is a decision that is the reflect of long reflections, and there's a lot of steps that you need to anticipate. And for instance, the networking is something that you should start years in advance. You have to build your network, and this is very important, and that takes time to get familiar with people from institutions, and that colleagues know you and trust you. But beside that, concretely to launch your practice, I think in my mind there's two very important points before going for it. Is one, how you will handle the change financially, which is, as we were just discussing, the most difficult parts. And for that, you need to establish, well, actually what I did is I established a business plan for the next few years, trying to make an estimate of my revenue on one hand, and on my additional costs on the other hand. And as Judith was mentioning before, it's very difficult to assess your revenue when you act as an arbitrator, since first, you don't know how many appointments you will get, and what would be the amount that you will get on each appointment. And secondly, even if you get some appointment for 1 year, you may not be paid for that year. So you have either to have savings or other source of revenues. And as for the charge, that was much easier to assess because it keeps increasing all the time. But I made a list before I started my practice, and I think as an indication, you have to take into consideration whether you will grant an office or not, all the fees that are linked to technology, which may be important, and the subscription to any law reviews, as Judith and Lucy were mentioning as well, which can be quite expensive, all the memberships, and the cost of representation and marketing as well, which they were mentioning too. And then a second step with for me is the creation of your identity. What would be the name of your firm? What would be your logo, and the creation of your website, which takes a lot of time and needs a lot of preparation in advance, as Brenda was mentioning, or will be mentioning, I'm not sure. It's good to establish a list of the cases you work on, because you will need to mention that on your website. And as far as I'm concerned, I wanted my website to be ready as soon as I started, so that everyone knew and could have a look at my website as soon as I was going to be on my own. And I'm sure there's a lot of other steps, but I will let the other panelists bring their input on that.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Actually, that's very helpful to kind of understand the granular aspects of starting to look at launching your own practice, and just even having that exercise of looking at what your costs are going to be, what your revenue streams are, and the very candid point which you've just made, that actually you should be prepared to dip into your savings at the very start, which actually is a nice segue into this question of financial planning, both for the launch and then afterwards in the management of the practice. And one question which we've had come up from a number of the attendees is looking at ensuring your pipeline of work before you launch the practice. So one question, and I'm going to ask this to Brenda, is after how many arbitral appointments did you feel sufficiently busy to set up your own shop?
Well, I think it's different for those of us coming out of big law than it is for people coming out of boutiques or coming out of institutions or other backgrounds, because the reality is once you reach a certain level of seniority in big law, the possibility of accepting appointments essentially dries up because you're conflicted for almost everything that you're appointed or that you're approached for. And so when I started off on my own, I had a number of appointments as a young arbitration practitioner that came from the institution, but my caseload, as I was, I think it was Lucy that said, as I was stepping off the cliff into that fog bank and not knowing where the ground was below, I wasn't bringing a bunch of cases with me. I was stepping off the cliff into a fog bank and hoping that the cases would come. But I think what you are doing is you're looking at how many people know you, how comfortable do you feel that you are in terms of levels of experience to be able to confidently go to the market and say, I can do this and I would be good at it. And I will be good at it, because then the appointments will come. But you kind of have to have ensured, as Catherine was saying, that you've got all the building blocks in place before you step off the cliff. So you've got to have the website and the reputation and the background and the connections and the list of cases that you've been involved with as counsel, so that you can, if someone comes to you and says, how many HKIAC cases have you done? How many ICC cases have you done? You know what those numbers are. You know what industries they're in. And, as someone who's probably a bit more senior than some of the others on this call, you think that you will remember them all, but eventually you forget some of them. So put them on a piece of paper or in a spreadsheet, because it's like, oh yeah, I know that I did this case about enzyme additives for dog food, but what institution was it? And what was the amount? So all of those things that you want to be able to talk about later, put them down somewhere because they'll be important for getting that marketing experience later.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I think that's very valuable advice. And you're right, you do tend to forget as you go the smaller, finer details of the cases that you work on. Judith, can I ask you a related question? So firstly, whether you agree with Brenda that it is the equivalent of stepping off a cliff in terms of going solo, and whether or not, if you are planning on doing that, you should also be potentially looking at bringing in other revenue streams in parallel, whether it's just for limited time only or whether focusing exclusively on arbitrator appointments is your recommendation or best practice.
Sure. So I don't feel like I stepped off a cliff into a fog. I had probably half a dozen arbitral appointments up and running when I officially set up my own practice. As I mentioned, the work can be lucrative, but it is up and down in terms of cash flow. So other revenue streams might be needed depending on your circumstances. I've had 2 alternative income streams, neither of which I really do for the money, but they could provide a financial safety net for any dry patches. So first, when I moved home, I had a transition period where I was still consulting for the PCA while building up my arbitrator appointments. But I formally ended that when I started running into conflicts. There were certain cases I obviously couldn't do while I was still there. But I did stay on one big long-running case in a private capacity to support the tribunal, really for continuity, but also a bit of pocket money, as well as the chance to keep working with and learning from some really distinguished lawyers who are on the tribunal. Secondly, I was appointed as a senior member of our state civil and administrative tribunal, and I decide about 10 cases a year. These are administrative law matters like licensing disputes, professional discipline, and freedom of information requests. I applied when Australia closed its borders, and I thought I might never leave the country again. But also being in my home country gives me an opportunity to perform public service in a way that I couldn't when I was an expat. And I find it very grounding work and a good way to connect with the legal profession locally, at the same time as building up hearing and decision-making experience really quickly, because they're small matters that you just rip through, and you can do as many or as little as you like. I don't do any counsel work because I avoid the conflicts. I also don't teach, though I have done that in the past. And I know there are other solo arbitrators like my fellow Aussie Lucy Martinez, who teach university courses, and that can provide an alternative revenue stream as well as another source of interesting professional engagement. But by and large, most of my time is spent on my arbitrator practice.
Thank you, Judith. One of the points which you mentioned earlier about revenue streams was obviously the fact that effectively your pay date with institutions is unpredictable and it does not come regularly. So I was wondering if we could talk about some of the difficulties associated with that and how you manage them. Lucy, would you be happy to pick that question up?
Sure, and it is a challenge, and I think I was certainly guilty of jumping off that cliff early without having done the very excellent groundwork and thought that Judith has just outlined. But for me, I very much decided that I would treat myself as a startup, that this was a long-term career that I was building and that I was investing in myself. So very like Catherine mentioned, I did my detailed business plan. It had fairly low expectations for the first year, but it really tracked everything I was going to need in terms of budgeting. I was in the very privileged position of having acted as counsel in big law for 20 years. And I really had to give myself talking to them, saying, no, I'm investing in myself. That said, I am guilty, like many, many women are, of undervaluing my time. And when it came to things like setting hourly rates, it was really difficult early on because I do a lot of work still in the US, and as many on the call will know, if you are a AAA or ICDR arbitrator, you're required to set your hourly rate. And I was very concerned that I didn't want to price myself out of matters early on, but my experience and skill set is for the major matters that are complicated and challenging, and you really ought to be charging a decent fee, or at least not underselling yourself. So I know that early on I probably got it wrong. I sat with some wonderful arbitrators, a couple of whom took me to one side after I'd chaired them and said, Lucy, you have to sort your hourly rates out. You should be charging at least $200 an hour more than you are charging. And so I got better at amending my rates. I also struggled early on with getting LCIA appointments, and as again people will know, you get sent we think the maximum should be this amount on that you're charging, and I had undercut that probably wrongly, but the value that I found was in talking to other people about hourly rates and being very open and transparent and saying to people, look, I'd like some advice here, and I have found that really useful. And I think we underestimate how much support there is out there in the international arbitration community and how willing people are to help you. And I echo what Mag said at the beginning of the call. I'm always available if people want to reach out. I'm very happy to jump on a Zoom and chat through these issues with people, because I benefited from other people calling me up when I went on my own and say, Lucy, you're about to make loads of mistakes. I know this because I made them. So, let's talk. And it's an iterative process. I fully accept that I got certain things wrong. But I also feel that I learned a lot during that process, and I'm far, far better informed than I was.
Thank you, Lucy. And Judith, I can see you nodding your head. Have you had similar issues in terms of fixing hourly rates, but also in terms of obtaining those payments from institutions? And what's your advice for those who are managing that revenue stream?
Well, so some institutions pay according to the amount in dispute, in which case you have a fair sense of what you're going to get paid, just that it won't be for a while. And some have hourly rates. Fairly early on, I did ask others in the Australian market what the going rate should be. And I was warned about not selling myself too short, because if you quote too low, it's not going to come across as good value, but as not having confidence in yourself. Somebody gave me the advice, and it really will depend on the case, but to pitch a rate that's just slightly below what law firm partners might be charging as an hourly rate, just as a general guide. And that person gave me some indication of what the big firms in the Australian market were charging. But it really might depend on the industry and the amount in dispute. So you have to be flexible, and actually, I guess it would be a bit like when you're at the bar and starting out. Like, there will be a period where the money doesn't come in, and eventually, there'll be a time lag of about a year when the revenue will start coming in. Some institutions are better than others at paying promptly, and that's always very welcome.
Thanks, Judith. I would like to ask some follow-up questions on the actual arbitral appointments. Some of you mentioned the business plan that you were preparing, trying to envisage how many arbitral appointments you could get in the years after you would establish your practice. And I think a question that many attendees would ask you is, what are the practical steps that you found more useful in trying to secure these arbitral appointments? Is it networking with institutions, networking with colleagues from law firms? Is it publishing? Is it doing other types of activities? I think that's a question that many of in our audience would like your views on. And maybe Catherine, would you like to share what has been your own experience in that?
Sure. Well, it's still an ongoing process for me since I started not such a long time ago. But I started by, I think, going to institutions in my region and trying to meet people there and network with them, trying to build a relationship and then expand in other institutions. But I think for that, it's very important that you meet people. So you go travel and go to conferences where there is an institution as well that's where you want to meet the right people. And so I would say that networking with institution, but with colleagues as well, is very, very important, because you also get appointment by colleagues. And this is, as I was mentioning before, a very long process. So you need to start this at the beginning of your career, I think, because it takes a long time to be known and for people to trust you. And certainly, I'm sure that publishing is as well very important, but this is an advice I have to apply more to myself. So I won't discuss about it right now.
Thanks, Catherine. Brenda, any follow-up views on this topic?
I would say I completely agree with Catherine that it's a long-term process, and for those on the call who haven't yet made the leap or who are a few more years away from making the leap, one of the most important things that you can do is just do a good job as counsel, because people remember you. And if you've done a good job as counsel and you've impressed an arbitrator or you've impressed opposing counsel, they'll remember you. And once they see that you're out on your own, they'll come to you and they'll say, we're looking for a chair, we're looking for a co-arb, we're looking to appoint someone. Conversely, if you have really made a bad impression at some point in your career, people remember that too. So, there's a lot that you can do to position yourself properly very early in your career. And that helps the reputation much more than schmoozing at a cocktail party. I mean, schmoozing at a cocktail party is necessary too, but people don't trust you because of a cocktail party. They trust you because they've seen your work.
I would absolutely agree on. Can I jump in on that? I would absolutely agree with Brenda and Catherine. I would also say work out what's almost unique to you, and make sure that you're communicating that in these sort of events that Catherine was describing, when you're getting around meeting the arbitral institutions or contacting law firms and things. When I meet people and I'm in marketing mode, I want them to remember two things about me. I want them to remember that I specialize in energy disputes and I'm qualified in the US. And those are my hooks, if you like, for how I market myself and my practice. And so either identifying what's special to you and making sure that you're communicating it, because if you're not communicating it, nobody else is really going to be. But if you don't have that kind of slightly niche thing, then if you're at an early stage in your career, working on developing something like that, I know it's easy for me to sit here and say that, but actually pursuing a niche area can be really beneficial.
Thanks, Lucy. I'd like to stay on the topic of profile raising, and we're going to move on to some more diversity-related questions. Obviously, we have seen many prominent female arbitrators set up their own shop in very recent years. You are 4 of those examples. The question that I have is whether or not this is a female trend, and also related to that, how important is profile raising to obtaining appointments, and is it more important for women than men to help them stand out in what is already a relatively crowded market? What are your thoughts on that, Lucy?
I mean, it is really interesting, isn't it? Because we are, I don't know whether it's a female trend or whether women are getting more publicity because we are, I guess, bucking the tradition of appointments going mainly to men. So it's difficult to see. I think maybe ask me in another 5 years on that one. We do face an additional hurdle in getting appointments, just for the pure fact that we are female. That is irrefutable fact. And so I think women who've come up through the ranks are extremely aware of that, and aware that we have to work harder to counteract the unconscious bias that exists in both men and women who are thinking about appointing us. I always said when I was counsel, I was just as unlikely to appoint a female arbitrator as my male colleague. Again, that is a fact, and it goes back to the level of social conditioning and gender stereotyping that we all are frankly subject to from the minute we're born. And thereafter. So we have to counteract that, and I think the way we do that is by profile raising, by trying to make sure that we pop into people's minds when they're thinking about who they should appoint, and that's very, very difficult to do when it comes to see where your appointments really came from.
It might be just me, but I think we were just slightly losing you towards the end. I'd like to ask Catherine, did you find that setting up your own practice with your own name, obviously Schroeder Arbitration, has helped you in getting arbitral appointments so far?
Well, it's difficult to say. I'm sure you get more visible when you act with your name on your firm, but I could not tell if this is the source of my appointment or not.
We had a question from one of our attendees to the panelists asking whether or not any of you have experienced gatekeeping in your efforts to break into the arbitrator circles, including from other female arbitrators, which is an interesting question. Judith, you had some thoughts about this.
Sure. Well, we were initially a little puzzled by the premise of the question. Certainly from my point of view, I have not experienced gatekeeping. If anything, I've experienced gate opening. I think there's plenty of work going around. I find, especially in the Asia Pacific region, there are a number of ways I've experienced gate opening. One is from the institutional point of view when I worked at the PCA, and even in connection with my role at Akika, where we weigh in on appointments. There is a proactive effort on behalf of institutions to make sure any lists of candidates include well-qualified women and a diversity of names. So if anything, there's a push towards consideration of female candidates. Another type of gate opening that I had in mind was if for any reason I'm unable to take a case or unable to do a speaking engagement or write an article or a chapter that I'm approached to do, I will always, rather than just simply say no, I will always try to think of one or two names to suggest as alternatives, because this does open the gate to other practitioners, and it also helps the person who invited you or approached you in the first place. So they maintain a positive image of you as somebody who's cooperative, even if you're not helping on that particular occasion, and it can open up opportunities for others to do it.
Thanks, Judith. That's actually very interesting, and it kind of links with what Catherine was saying earlier about the importance of networking with institutions, but she also mentioned the importance of networking with colleagues. And actually, a follow-up question which I had there was, when we refer to colleagues, who are we referring to? Are we referring to other arbitrators or, ex law firm colleagues, or perhaps a combination of both? And Brenda, I guess the question for you is, does your experience echo Judith's in terms of that backwards and forwards of handing potential arbitrator appointments that you're conflicted out of to other arbitrators, and does that come back around?
I think it does, and it's not just appointments, as Judith said. It's also speaking engagements and other opportunities. One of the things, and to build on something else that Judith said, when I first was considering stepping out into this role away from the law firm, I took polls of a number of colleagues, both in other firms and independent arbitrators, and what do you think? Is this a stupid idea? And the overwhelming response from the men to whom I spoke was, we're always looking for female arbitrators to appoint as chair. And so I think there is also that gate opening coming from our male colleagues. And to go to the other half of your question, who do we mean when we say colleagues? It's other arbitrators, it's lawyers at law firms, it's the arbitration community as a whole community, because we all support each other, or we should be all supporting each other, and it's not just we appoint each other, but also there's a lot of communication that occurs among the arbitrators on a kind of informal, no names, anonymized basis of, I've got this interesting issue. How would you deal with this issue? Or what do you think would be useful here? Or how would you word this language in a procedural order? So you're always talking with each other, not in a way, it's still your decision, but you're seeking new thoughts and ideas.
That's so interesting. I wanted to ask a related question, looking also at the list of attendees, the participants in this webinar. I recognize some friends and colleagues, and they're not necessarily all from major arbitration centers like Paris or London. And one question that we had received in the preparation of this webinar was whether when you decide to launch your female solo arbitrator practice, you actually need to be already established in one of the major arbitration hubs as a sort of condition to be successful. And maybe a related question is also whether you should be targeting only one of the major arbitration institutions to get appointment, or whether it's wiser to diversify your networking efforts towards more potential sources of income and appointments, or whether that kind of dilutes in the end your chances of success. Maybe Judith, would you like to address the first one, at least on the arbitration hub one needs to be based on?
Sure. So I think the answer is no, you don't need to be established in one of the major arbitration hubs, in terms of you don't need to set up your practice in one of the major arbitration hubs. Though I do think it's very valuable to have spent some time working in a major arbitration hub and building a network there. So in my case, I have my practice out of Sydney, Australia. I had spent many years in New York and The Hague, while still keeping a foot in the door in Australia. I think especially in light of technological advances and everybody's experience during the pandemic of working from wherever we are, as long as you have an excellent internet connection, you can do this job from anywhere. It might also be easier to make a name for yourself in a smaller market. One piece of advice, I don't know if I'm jumping the gun on advice giving, but one little concrete piece of advice I would suggest is to get to know the members of your ICC National Committee. Make sure you know who they are and that they know who you are, because that is a common way to get your first appointment, would be on the nomination of your National Committee. So I managed to run my practice from Sydney, which is the largest city in Australia, but I know some excellent professionals within Australia who do it from even less hub-like locations. Some of them are on this call. So I think you still need to show your face in person every now and then in the major hubs, and make the most of opportunities that if you're in Paris or Singapore for a hearing, to go and meet the people from the institutions, and also maintain an online presence, whether that's through your own website or LinkedIn, or doing the occasional webinar like we're doing now, is also very useful.
Thanks, Judith. Brenda, do you have the same type of experience?
I would say the same. I think it is important if you're, and I base this partially on my time in Sydney, but more on my time in Shanghai. If you are in a jurisdiction that's a bit farther off the mainstream, it is important to be visible in a hub or more than one hub. It's also important, I think, to get exposure to institutions from outside of whatever jurisdiction is your home base. So if you're Shanghai, for example, and doing only CTAC cases, well, that's great. Because you're building up experience, but it's useful to also reach out to probably ICC, HKIAC, SEAC, in order to be visible to the other institutions as well. I think putting all of your eggs in one institutional basket is limiting, and the more that you can diversify and internationalize those baskets, even if you're not in a major hub, the better your chances will be.
Thanks so much, Brenda. Judith was already mentioning some piece of advice, and that I would like each of you to give to especially the younger attendees in this webinar that are really keen to know, what is the advice that you would give them, and especially if they are considering in the future becoming an arbitrator, before we open the Q&A session. So maybe Catherine, what would be your piece of advice to colleagues, younger colleagues that may take the leap one day?
I'll give three very short ones. Work hard, be proactive, and be visible.
That was very efficient and to the point. Lucy, do you have any different advice that you would give?
I love Catherine's three points there. I would say I would add to that self-belief and self-promotion.
Judith?
So in theme with my earlier advice, I would say do work overseas, but don't lose touch with your home jurisdiction. That includes knowing your ICC National Committee. It includes knowing the people at the International Arbitration Institution in your jurisdiction. And if you're like me, interested in public international law, also know the government officials who work in foreign affairs or the Ministry of Finance or the Attorney General's Department.
Thanks. And Brenda?
I suppose, since I agree with everything that's already been said, which were all excellent pieces of advice, I would add particularly for the youngest of the practitioners on the call, don't lose contact with your colleagues from early in your career. Stay in touch, because those are the people that are going to be the general counsels or the partners or whomever 5-10 years from now. And that's the network that you need to be building, because you can't build a network overnight. You have to build a network over the course of 5 or 10 years. And so I know it sounds trite, but reach out to people on LinkedIn or whatever your poison may be, and make sure that you're keeping in touch with them. If they have moved jurisdictions, well, send a note.
Thanks so much, everyone. The Q&A is now open. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask. And while we wait for questions to trickle in, I guess one question which we did discuss before this panel was, at what stage in your career, if you are thinking about becoming an arbitrator, is the right time to start taking steps towards either planning the launch of your solo practice or even thinking about getting those first appointments? We did discuss this. I'll let Lucy give her thoughts on that.
I mean, thank you. I talk about this in terms of building a runway, and I said earlier I was very guilty of not building that runway, which is why the cliff was quite so big. But it's never too early to start building that platform. And even if you don't actually use the runway, it's going to help you. So it's very much about, as Brenda, I think, said early on, identifying your experience, writing it down, thinking about where you can be proactive in your practice to perhaps develop that niche that I talked about. Because if this is something you would like to do, then having that runway built will be absolutely invaluable to you. And there's no right time. It's a very, very personal decision. I felt very strongly that it was the right time for me. Others have waited 5-10 years longer than I waited to make that transition. So that's a question only you can answer. But you can certainly start to put those building blocks in place really almost from day one in your arbitration career.
Thank you, Lucy. Right, the Q&A is open. I don't have any questions that are trickling through, but so we've got a question from Thais. We see a number of independent arbitrators who've worked for institutions and law firms, but is it possible to become an arbitrator having only worked in law firms? It seems like networking with institutions is vital for a first appointment. Brenda, would you like to take that question?
It's absolutely possible. I spent my whole career in law firms. What is harder is particularly coming out of big law, because in most cases you won't have, the 50 awards that you've written to point to, because you've been conflicted from so many of the larger cases, which comes back to the earlier advice, particularly as a young arbitration practitioner, be visible to the institutions, because the institutions like to appoint young practitioners to small and difficult cases to give them some experience. Once you get to be, a mid-level partner, they don't put you on those tiny, interesting cases anymore. And so you have a conflict problem. So the more that you kind of front load those early appointments, the better off you are. But again, if you've been doing fabulous counsel work and impressing people, they'll turn to you as for the arbitrator role as well.
Thank you, Brenda. We've also had a question about how important academic background is in establishing your own arbitration practice. So, whether or not, again, you have to have that big law background, or whether it's sufficient to have that slightly more academic background as a professor. I don't know if any of our panelists would like to take that one.
I would just say that there are arbitrators out there who are excellent arbitrators who don't have a law degree at all. They're, engineers or other backgrounds. So no, you don't need big law.
And I would completely endorse that. I think we shouldn't pigeonhole people into this. What I think unites us all as solo arbitrators is our passion for what we do, and how we've got there. It's all sorts of different routes through. But if it's something you really want to do, then you shouldn't worry about where you come from. It's more about looking forward to how you get to where you want to be. And there's an awful lot you can do, whether you are in big law or are in academia, to make the chances of you getting where you want to be much more realistic.
Thanks, Lucy. I think this has just been a wonderful panel. I think there's been so much fantastic advice from everything from, networking at the very early stages of your career. Brenda, you mentioned making sure that you're keeping a list, and Lucy, you also mentioned this, keeping a list of all of your relevant experience, because you never know when it will come in handy, all the way through to building those network with other arbitrators, and also other female arbitration practitioners, which it sounds like have been an incredibly invaluable source to each of you in helping brainstorm some of those important questions of how to set your hourly rate, or how to make certain decisions on the cases which you're working on. So I think this has been very comforting. It's given us a lot of food for thought. And I'm sure that everyone who has joined us will have taken a lot away from this panel. So thank you again, each, for your time. I've set in the chat the list, the websites for each of our panelists. And Lucy's just mentioned again that she's happy to have a conversation with anyone who'd like to reach out to her directly. So with all of that, I think we're going to close the webinar. The recording will be made available on the Pledge website shortly. And thank you all again, everyone, for joining, and to our panelists especially.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.